Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I acknowledge the Blue Moana Pacific for providing the space for the Pacific COP26 demand to be amplified here at this very important occasion. So, welcome. I know it's been a long day for everyone, but thank you for joining us visually or even at the hub venue. Thank you very much for your time and your patience. My apology. There's supposed to be a few speakers to be presented at this very important occasion. Unfortunately, they will not be present here with us due to the fact that some of them are still traveling on their way to Glasgow. And one of our speakers recently tested positive COVID-19. So I will be only presenting on our behalf as the Pacific Islands Climate Action Network Project, Climate Justice Project Officer, and as well as one of the young youth activists in Vanuatu. So I believe you will enjoy the presentation. It will be a very short presentation before you all have your good rest for tonight. Hope you enjoy. Well, the order of our presentation today will first begin with a short two video actually, and then the end of our presentation. It will be very short. I know you might have some question, but hopefully we will give you time, or somehow maybe not. We'll see how it goes. Let me start off. Pacific Islands Climate Action Network is an informal network linking civil society, organizations working on climate change. Since 2013, it has brought together civil society across the Pacific Island countries, advocating for climate justice and environmental integrity. Pacific Islands Climate Action Network aims to unite civil society under a common voice to increase governments to respond with more powerful and ambitious climate change policies and action at the national and regional level. As part of PCAN, the worldwide network of as part of CAN International, the worldwide network of over 1,500 non-governmental organizations across the world, PCAN works to ensure the Pacific Island civil society is represented at the international level. And also, PCAN recognizes the unique challenges that the Pacific civil society organization face in their work, remoteness, low population size, isolation from international networks, vulnerability to environmental and economic shocks, and the high degree of vulnerability of Pacific people and communities, in particular from our geographical remoteness, the small scale of our economics, high cost, and the adverse effect of climate change and natural disasters, and increasing loss and damage from permanent and irreversible impact of human-induced climate change.
Your PowerPoint sharings. You have to share your screen. It's a green button at the bottom line.
Oh, sorry. Oh, good. Well, I guess you can.
And now, yes, that's perfect. But no, we don't have any picture from you, but I think it's not as bad. We have the charts. I give you a command. Just wait a second. Okay, go on. No, 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 not go on. Now go on.
All right, thank you very much. Apologize for that. Now, here we are. These are the Pacific COP26 demands. The question asked here is made up of, or the Pacific COP26 demand is made up of different civil society organizations, as I mentioned earlier, that PCAN is part of a regional non-government organization that part of PCAN. So they all come up with the COP26 demands. So the question asked here, what do the Pacific people and communities want to see at COP26? So there are 7 top line messages altogether that brings together civil society organization in the Pacific stood up for demanding at this COP26. First one is no more fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are fossils. You keep them in the ground to serve the Pacific. No new gold, oil or gas project, an immediate end to all fossil fuel subsidies everywhere. Pacific Civil Society Organization demand commitment to NDCs. Show real commitment. Your NDCs must limit global heating to 1.5 degrees. We're already out of time in the islands. Sustained, radical, and social just cuts to emissions are required no later. One of the policy demand on climate finance is show us the money, mobilize all of the promised 100 billion USD annually until 2025, and agree that politics must pay the trillions actually needed for resilient Pacific peoples and communities. In the loss and damage is life and death in the Pacific. We demand that international leaders, your political will is required now to finance and deliver support to the Pacific people who are already losing everything. This is the reality of the experiences that the Pacific people are currently facing. And it's worse if there are no action made at this COP26, a commitment are made. Climate change is a system of deeper injustices, inequalities, gender justice, and women's human rights and empowerment is precondition for climate, social, economic, and ecological, and climate justice. Pacific civil society organization demand that climate justice will prevail. And we demand that your emissions are already responsible for the loss of universal human rights and environmental rights of Pacific people, communities, and the ecosystems. We will see you in court of law and in all other forums to protect and retain our rights. We believe in inclusive participation. Global climate negotiation at COP26 must be inclusive, intersectional, and intergenerational. Do not dare to marginalize the voices of Pacific Island people. Thank you very much. I will now proceed on with a song that was composed by Vanuatu local artist. Enjoy. Thank you.
them in the ground, no new coal, oil or gas projects. Stop all subsidies and show your commitment. Reduce your emission, reduce your pollution. Yeah, your NDCs, please limit your heating to 1.5 degrees. Leaders of the world, hear our voices. Come to our cries from the ground and in the skies. Pacific Islands are calling. We demand climate justice, and we demand more action, not just for today, but for all future generations. Whoa, future generations. This is their cry. Oh, this is their voice. The Pacific demands, show us your money, fulfill your promises. Oh, $100 billion and $1 trillion more, just like what you promised us to safeguard Pacific people's lives. Yeah, loss and damage is life and death. Your political will is all that we need. Yeah, yeah, yeah. We demand climate justice, yes, and we demand for action, action, not just for today, but for all future generations. We are losing everything. We are facing climate change. They're all symptoms of injustice, signs of inequalities, gender injustice. So gender empowerment will help remedy this. We will sing, yes, and we will fight. We will make sure that our voices be heard. Yeah, yeah, yeah. We demand climate justice, and we demand for action right now, not just for today, but for all future generations. The Pacific is demanding justice will prevail. Take responsibility of your own emissions. Don't you know your pollution causes loss of life, loss of environmental and human rights? Oh, Pacific people are uniting and demanding for justice. Their voices be heard. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The Pacific Islands are all in crisis. Our islands are sinking and climates are changing. We demand that our voices be heard. Negotiate, be inclusive as much as you can. Intergenerational, in every age and in every race. Intersectional, in every gender and every class. We won't be pushed aside, no, we won't be marginalized. Together with one voice, Pacific rise up and say,
Demand climate justice. We demand for action right now, not just for today, but for all future generations.
Thank you very much. Can we play the second video?
My name is Lorenzo Raplili. I am from the country of Vanuatu in the Pacific Islands.
My name is Roni Simbaro. I am from the country of Fiji Islands in the Pacific Islands.
My name is Tanya Afu and I am from the country of Solomon Islands in the Pacific Islands.
My name is Rebecca and I am from the country of Kiribati in the Pacific Islands.
My name is Marie Juanita Melsebury and I come from the beautiful country of Vanuatu in the Pacific Islands.
My name is Belinda Rekimani and I am from the country of Solomon Islands in the Pacific Islands.
My name is Laveta Malaki Seru and I'm from Fiji in the Pacific Islands.
The people and the communities of the Blue Pacific are living in climate emergency, a crisis that sadly continues to be ignored by many countries, including those nearest to our islands.
The Pacific is leading a charge using our Pacific culture, tradition, and wisdom of ecological and social stewardship to bring us through the current global climate catastrophe.
We are committed to a climate-stable Pacific future that is unified, intersectional, and intergenerational.
In the lead up to COP26, we, the civil society of the Pacific Islands, demand climate justice and action now.
The Pacific demands that fossil fuels are fossils and you keep them in the ground to serve the Pacific.
No new coal, oil, or gas projects, and an immediate end to all fossil fuel subsidies everywhere.
The Pacific demands that you show real commitment and your NDCs must limit global heating to 1.5 degrees. We are already out of time in the Pacific.
Sustained, radical and socially just cuts to emissions are required now and not later.
The Pacific demands that you show us the money.
Mobilize all the promised 100 billion annually USD until 2025.
And agree that polluters must pay the trillions actually needed for resilient Pacific peoples and communities.
The Pacific witnesses that loss and damage is life and death.
Your political will is required now to finance and deliver support to the Pacific people who are already losing everything.
The Pacific declares that climate change is a symptom of deeper injustice and inequalities.
Gender justice and women's human rights and empowerment is a precondition for climate, social, economic, ecological, and climate justice.
The Pacific asserts that climate justice will prevail.
Your emissions are already responsible for the loss of universal human rights and environmental rights of Pacific people, communities, and ecosystems.
We will see you in courts of law and in all other forums to protect and retain our rights.
The Pacific demands that global climate negotiations on COP26 must be inclusive, intersectional, and intergenerational. Do not marginalize the voices of the Pacific Islands people at COP26.
Do not marginalize the voices of the Pacific Island peoples at COP26.
Do not marginalize the voices of Pacific Island peoples at COP26.
Do not marginalize the voices of the Pacific Island people at COP26.
Do not marginalize the voices of our Pacific peoples at COP26.
Do not marginalize the voices of Pacific Island peoples at COP26.
Do not marginalize.
Do not.
Do not marginalize
Do not marginalize the voices of our
Island people at
Pacific people
COP26.
at COP26.
Participants in this webinar. We thank you from the Pacific Islands. My name is Christopher Bartlett, and I'm virtually attending COP26 from Port Vila, Vanuatu, as part of the Vanuatu delegation, and also as a member of the Pacific Islands Climate Action Network. I think what we've seen in the lead up to this COP26 is that civil society are absolutely unwavering in their demands for climate action here in the Pacific, and placing those demands squarely at the feet of leaders of the world who are responsible for the climate emergency in which we find ourselves. The collaboration among Pacific civil society is united, and as you've seen from the demands, the determination to solve this climate crisis is high, from the smallest grassroots initiatives in the islands to the largest Pacific non-government organizations working on climate action. I think the top level demands that you've heard in this video and during this webinar are reflective of where the Pacific sees the only future for our world. The first demand on fossil fuels is absolutely non-negotiable. We cannot continue to use a resource that undermines our own ability to survive on this planet. Fossil fuels are only one of many sources of energy that could keep us alive, keep us healthy and happy, with high well-being and a high standard of living. And there is no excuse that governments around the world continue to subsidize and put trillions of dollars per year into fossil fuels that result in trillions of dollars per year of loss and damage. That brings us to the top line demand of loss and damage. I think this COP is clearly putting loss and damage where it deserves to be, and that's on par with our needs for mitigation adaptation. Loss and damage is a third pillar of the Paris Agreement, and it means life and death for us in the Pacific Islands. Loss and damage is, in fact, the indicator of how well we are achieving the goals of both the UNFCCC Convention itself, but also the Paris Agreement. And it's clear that every year in the Pacific, more and more lives are lost, livelihoods are compromised, and Pacific identities are being undermined. In terms of the goals of NDCs, 1.5 is no longer an aspirational target. It is a required target. There can be no NDC pathways for any other future than less than 1.5 degrees. An overshoot of 1.5 degrees would be catastrophic for the Pacific Islands. Even now, at over 1 degree, the experiences of Pacific Islanders are horrendous and horrific. We cannot imagine a world. In fact, we would not have a world at anything more than 1.5 degrees. In terms of our calls for finance, we acknowledge that parties identified a $100 billion annual target for climate finance, but that target does not reflect the actual needs of Pacific Island people and community. The needs that we have are in the trillions of dollars. And it is unacceptable that rich developed countries cannot mobilize what they promised way back in the early 2000s. Here we are now in 2021, and it looks like they won't even be able to meet that promise by 2023. And that, from the point of view of Pacific civil society, is unacceptable. If we can mobilize more than $10 trillion for a COVID pandemic, which causes loss of life and suffering equal to climate change, why can't we even manage $100 billion US? So from the Pacific civil society perspective, this is absolutely intolerable and won't be accepted. And so the new climate finance goal from 2025 onward must reflect the real needs of Pacific Island communities. I think a key ask from the Pacific is that the issue of human rights cannot be ignored, and that justice for infringements on those rights will be upheld. And the Pacific civil society is very clear. If the UNFCCC mechanism is unable to protect those rights, then Pacific Island people and communities and governments will fight for those rights in other venues. And the court system and climate litigation is a pathway that perhaps polluters, both companies and countries, will take more note of than climate negotiations under UNFCCC. So the Pacific civil society is putting those polluters on notice that the court systems is a very viable and active pathway for those of us in the Pacific. The demand on the inclusivity of this COP. I am now here in Vanuatu with at least 5 civil society members who would have and should have been at COP had it not been for the untenable barriers to participation. Here in the Pacific Islands, many of our borders are still closed. So we have, example, people who cannot even travel unless there's a charter flight. And those charter flights are 5 and 6 times the cost of getting on a commercial airline. Not only that, if they were to travel to COP, they wouldn't be able to get home because of repatriation restrictions. In addition, it's terrible news, but many of our Pacific Island friends and family in Glasgow have now contracted COVID-19. So the health emergency is not a theoretical one. So all of these factors combined have absolutely restricted and limited the voices of Pacific Island civil society at this COP. And so there is no way that world leaders or parties to the UNFCCC can claim that this has been an inclusive COP. This includes members of the most vulnerable, members of youth, the elderly, the LGBTQI community, members from civil society and indigenous groups, all of these voices which are essential to finding a sustainable pathway for this planet are not at COP26. We demand simply that Pacific Island voices will not be marginalized. And through this video that you've heard and through the song, which I hope we can play again as a closing, the song, that the world leaders will continue to hear Pacific Island voices, and rest assured that we will not stop fighting for the most vulnerable in our communities in the Pacific Islands. So thank you so much from the Pacific Island Climate Action Network.